For instance, one of the sermons I preached a long time ago was, "Is there not a cause?" From 1 Samuel 17:29, where it says, "And David said," and this is response to his brothers, "What have I now done? Is there not a cause?" And we'll look at that. But I've also preached on this as well and entitled it, "Facing Your Giant." What an absolute thrill to be able to take and make application, New Testament application to us about how that we can, because we all have giants in our lives. We all have those moments in our lives where we need to become a giant killer. And so that's where even we can look at the title of Overcoming Obstacles. You see what I'm doing? I'm giving you different titles that all revolve around this same story. From another person, I had the title, not this one, but of spiritual leadership. Again, you'll see that. But then the one that I thought, this one was a good one, the underdog who overcame. That's what he was. Our course, like I said, title for tonight, if I were to give you a different one, "Is There Not a Cause?" would be the one from 1 Samuel 17 and verse 29. While Saul and his army went into battle against the Philistines, and we know what prior to this, all the verses, the first 14 verses we'll talk about with David and how that his father wanted to find out how his sons were doing and sent him to bring some food and find out what's going on. And so in verse 15, we find where it says, "But David went and returned from Saul to feed his sheep at Bethlehem." Well, what did we find out from there? Well, what happened? Remember, he was there trying to sing and calm Saul. And he did, but then he went back to his sheep. He didn't go out to the military, the battle. The armies of Philistines, we find out, stood on one side of the valley, while the Israelites stood on the other side. And they'd have a skirmish every now and then. And you'll see that even in tonight's lesson. And so again, Jesse wanted to know how it went for his eldest son. So in verse 20, it says, "David rose up early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him, and came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight, and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brethren." I don't think that's just talking about his Israelite brethren. I think it's talking about his own brothers, his three eldest brothers that were there. "And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words, and David heard them." Now, if you think back just a little bit, and I want to remind you, before this battle, before this went on, Saul had been victorious over the Philistines. In fact, Jonathan had started it all by sneaking up into the fortification of the Philistines, and his armor bearer killed 20 of them and put them in array, and then God brought them a quaking and a shaking into their midst, and then Saul jumped up and he began to beat the Philistines. But things have changed. That spirit that was once in Saul has left Saul. And so we see that the giant named Goliath came out onto the field, and he shouted a challenge to the Israelites, both in the morning, maybe it was a late morning, and an early evening, I don't know. But here's what he did. He came out, and all the men of Israel, when he came out and yelled at them, says when they saw the man, they didn't even hear him yet. They just simply saw him. They fled from him and were sore afraid. And verse 25, the men of Israel said, have you seen this man that has come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up, and it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. In other words, you're going to be tax-free for the rest of your life. All your family will be. Well, that's a wonderful inducement. Well, I don't know. Was Goliath not an early riser? Maybe he didn't have to. He let them go out and fight for a while. He'd probably have somebody fix him a big breakfast of 17 eggs and 30 pounds of bacon, because you got to think of how big this guy was. Then he would come out, and they would run and hide. What a difference from the previous battles. They take note of the king's reward for taking out Goliath. And so then in verse 26, David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine? And notice this, and taketh away the reproach from Israel. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Now, if you can't find a title in that verse, there's something wrong with you too. For any preacher, at least, it's worth his salt, should be able to find a good particular title there. David had brought food from his father, sent to his brothers. He saw and heard the challenge by this giant Philistine, but he also saw the army of Israel being dismayed and greatly afraid. In fact, go back, and in verse 11 says, when Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. I mean, they were freaked out about it. Well, where is the prayer of Saul? Where is the prayer, Saul the king leading his people into prayer? Where is he calling for the prophet? There's nothing of that at all. As they were talking, of course, by talking, I'm talking about David and his brothers and some of the others. Goliath did, again, what he had been doing for 40 straight days. Every day, every morning, every evening, Goliath would come out and yell a challenge to all of the army of Israel. You send out a man to fight me, no sense all of us dying here. Send out a man to challenge me, and whoever wins, then, I should really say, whoever loses, you have to become our slave. Well, that's why nobody wanted to go fight him. Think about this. Saul and all Israel. Now, we're talking about the army. But anybody that was out there heard those words, and they were dismayed and greatly afraid. But did you notice what David heard? David wasn't dismayed. David didn't greatly fear. I'm only going to read the latter part of that. It says, after he said, who's going to take, what about this that takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? What's up with this? You guys not know who you're fighting for? Have you forgotten what he has done for you just in the last couple of battles that we've had? This is a very much different view than those by everyone that was in this battle. They saw certain death. They feared. They were dismayed when they saw the giant Goliath come onto the battlefield. There's a lot of times when we have certain things that enter into our life that we see certain death, or we are afraid, or we are dismayed. We need the vision of David. We need to see what he saw. He did not see like anyone else there. Now, you have to think that David was, as already reported, a very nice-looking, young, short guy. I'm thinking he was well under 6 foot. Some have calculated that Goliath was anywhere between 9'9" and 11'4". Tallest man on record, I believe, is 8'11". Now that's tall. I mean, 7 foot is pretty tall. I've told this story before when I went to one of the Kings games and we were playing the Houston Rockets, and it was when Hakeem Olajuwon and now his name's Ralph Sampson were on that same team, and they were both practicing on the floor, and I got to go early, and literally I went down to the floor, and they wouldn't come up, shake your hand or anything else because they're practicing, but the both of them happened to walk over and were within maybe 10 to 15 feet of me. My goodness. Two of the tallest men in basketball at the time. Shocking to see them that tall. Goliath, it says, people again in all these calculations are very different, but they said his armor was between 150 pounds, and I think that's pretty light, up to 250 pounds. His armor. The spear that he carried had a head on the end of it that was about equal to what we know as a 16-pound bowling ball. In fact, that's the minimum that it would have weighed. That's pretty heavy. Most of us can't chuck that down a bowling alley very well or very far, let alone throw it on the end of a spear. You also have to think that he had to be intimidating just to see him that tall. Let's take the shortest at 9'9". Unbelievable. Go into the high school room in the other building and you'll see they've got a layout, a diagram of him being 9'9" on that wall and how big that is. It's unbelievable. But now, not just his height, look at him dressed for war, equipped with armor, having his weapons about him and a helmet the size of a giant pumpkin to sit on his giant head. Now Saul was taller than any of his warriors, and yet he would look like a runt up against Goliath. How did he respond? He was afraid and dismayed. How did David respond? He saw an uncircumcised giant defying the armies of the living God, and when he was challenged by his brothers, he said, "Is there not a cause?" He was humble, but he was both bold and brave. Their indignation did not deter David's questions or his search for an answer. He simply, as it says, he turned from his brothers toward another and spake after the same manner. He didn't argue, he didn't fuss, he didn't fight with him. And the people answered him again after the former manner. Again, instead of fighting with his eldest brother or even rebuking him, he just turned away and asked others the same question. Talk among the army began. Talk began that there was a man in their ranks who was willing to fight this giant. This man was asking about what the king would do for that man who killed this uncircumcised Philistine. Verse 31, it says, "And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and Saul sent for him." David's spirit was not deterred. In fact, he told the king in verse 32, David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him." I mean, think of that. He's saying this to the king. "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with the Philistine." He saw what happened to the men who had heard Goliath's challenge. David saw the failure of faith. He saw the faithless vision And it was this vision which then spoke from Saul. Saul had no confidence in David whatsoever. Verse 33, Saul said unto David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. You're inexperienced. No confidence. David again was not distracted or deterred by his brothers, by the king, or even what's going to happen a little bit from Goliath. What did he do? Verse 36, he recounted the story. He told Saul that thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David did not lack confidence. Verse 37, David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, the Lord be with you. You idiot. I added that in there. He didn't say that. But he did say, Lord be with thee. Saul had no argument. He did offer David his armor, but David refused it. He said it would restrict his movement. It would offer no true defense. His defense was not armor. His defense was the Lord. His defense was the tried and true defense of his staff and his sling. When David faced his brothers, he was challenged. When David faced his brethren on the front lines, he was challenged. When David faced Saul, he was challenged. When David faced Goliath, he was challenged. Everywhere he went, his faith was challenged. When he got out onto that field, the Philistine said unto David in verse 43, am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. But you know what? Before ever David stepped onto that battlefield, he was prepared. He had been prepared. David was prepared to be used of the Lord, and he needed only what he had proved himself before. Well, what had he proved? Better, the question is, who had he proved? He had proved the Lord. Then David, verse 45, said to the Philistine, thou comest to me. This to me, again, one of the most famous scriptures, again, in this whole story. Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. You notice that's said at least 3 different times in here. And then he says this, why I said there's no lacking confidence. He says, this day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand. And I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. What a statement of faith. What courage and what confidence in the Lord. Now, the distance between them at this point was still an advantage to David. David, of course, had just a sling. I'm not going to read the fact that he went to the brook and picked up 5 smooth stones, put them into his pouch, and went into the battlefield. But Goliath needed to be much closer. If he was going to kill David, he had to be within arm's length. He wanted to slice David in half, I'm sure. And he knew he could do it if he could ever get that sword to the body of David. But David could use his speed and agility to get within the right distance, to get just the right shot with his sling. David could use his faith to encourage Saul and his army. David knew that he was outmanned or outgunned, but that didn't matter because David knew that the Philistine was outGod. He was without God. Verse 48, it says, "And it came to pass when the Philistine arose, and David came nigh to meet, and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted." He wasn't fearful. He wasn't hanging back, but it says he ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead. And that stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. Again, he wanted them to know it's not with sword or with shield or with spear, but with the strength of the Lord. What did he do? He just took a sling. David trusted in God, not in military training. David prepared himself and he gathered the tools that he was familiar with to fight Goliath. David did not stand still. He was not confused. He was not fearful of what to do. David exudes confidence. By his actions, notice this, by his actions, David now really becomes the leader of Israel. He's filled with the Spirit of God. He certainly becomes the leader of the armies of Israel. Again, we never read that Saul prayed. We never read that Saul ever spoke like David did, and he certainly never led Israel like David did. But David wasn't done. After he slew Goliath, he took the sword of his enemy. He cut off the head of Goliath and took it with him. And then what does it say in verse 52? The men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines until thou come into the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sharam, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. The Philistines were shocked at what had just happened. For 40 days, no one came to challenge, and then this little kid comes out, probably 20 years old. Who knows how old he was exactly. And here he is now taking Goliath's head, his sword, and his armor. All of that, he took it back to Jerusalem, put him in his tent. That was his spoil. There was his reminder that the Lord was with him. And he did deliver him on that day. Now we have a passage that confuses a lot of people and makes others deny that this is the inspired account. In fact, they will say, well, it's really confusing because this chapter needs to go back up here and do before another chronological. I think it needs to be right where it's at. What verse am I talking about? Verse 56. When Saul saw this, and he then asked, whose son is he? Well, didn't you just meet him? Didn't you just know who it was? Well, the king said, inquire thou whose son the stripling, the adolescent, is. In verse 55, you go back there, and that's the word for adolescent as well. David came to Saul as the singer. He came to Saul as the shepherd. He came to Saul as the servant. But now he comes to Saul as the soldier. and soon he will come to Saul as the sovereign of Israel. Saul didn't recognize him because Saul was too self-absorbed. I doubt that he ever even looked up when David sang to him. He was too concerned and too consumed with his own evil spirit that was upon him. And when that evil spirit was gone, he probably sent David away. I don't need you anymore. That's why he sent him back to the shepherd fold. He was just fine. He was forgetful. And David, it says, returned from the slaughter of the Philistines. Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Now, again, I just want to make you think a little bit. This is the head on top of a giant. I don't think this is just a regular person-sized head. This is a big old head. I think this is a pretty memorable moment that he brings David in, and David comes, a young man, a young short guy, carrying a guy's head that's probably almost dragging the ground. And maybe it was dragging the ground. Verse 58, and Saul said to him, whose son art thou, thou young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Again, I would bet that that's seen. As many times as it seems that Saul has forgotten who David was, again, I think it's not surprising to me. Saul's too self-absorbed. Saul is too big for his own britches. He doesn't care about who is anywhere or anyone. David stood there with that head in his hand, bowing respectfully and giving him his name and the name of his family. All of his family will now be living tax-free, and David will soon be living in the king's palace anyway. It's the same way that we looked at David as kind of Christ-like, in that our Savior fought the greatest giant who taunts us. But Jesus Christ has won and has brought us back the proof. He has rewarded us for his victory, and his family has won the victory with him. We are Christ's family, and we are made his own. We won the inheritance in Jesus Christ. David has shown us that faith wins the victory. There is no enemy that we can encounter in this world that we cannot overcome. Faith is the victory that overcomes the world. David and Goliath is not a made-up story. It's not a mythology. It is a true story, a story that encourages the faith of every Christian. It is a story that shows a young man seeking to honor God above all. He sought to honor Jehovah, who was being dishonored by a heathen who did so publicly, and by a people who allowed it to continue on. David did not seek the riches, but if you go back again to verse 26, he sought to remove the reproach from Israel. Remember, there are observers to this story. Saul saw it. Abner, the captain of the host, saw it. Jonathan, Saul's son, who again I remind you had recently infiltrated the fortified camp of the Philistines and slew 20 of them, he saw it. They saw David stand up to this giant Goliath. They saw his victory. They saw his bravery. And they saw how he led Israel to defeat the Philistines after being taunted for 40 days and 40 nights. They saw. And that's the problem. They saw and they were led by their sight. David saw, but he was led by his eyes of faith. Instead of seeing the enemy, he saw God and he did not falter. I'll end with this. To me, this is the whole outline of the message. When David's brother disparaged him, they said, "You just came to see the battle. You're full of pride. You just want self-advancement. In other words, you've got bad motives." That was the disparagement. Not the case. Saul diminished him. "You're just a little guy. You're a pipsqueak." Can you imagine Saul taller than everybody else? And David seems like a little runt. Inexperienced, no abilities to fight. He didn't diminish him just in size, but in ability. Goliath despised him. Goliath cursed David and used Jehovah's name in doing so. He made light and little of David's size and preparedness and mocked him and his army. Well, what's the key to this? When his brothers disparaged him, when Saul diminished him, when Goliath despised him, David disregarded them. He paid no attention to them. How did he do so? By trusting in Jehovah, his God. His motive was to honor God and to remove the dishonor. He had a great deal of experience in trusting God when all of the odds were against him, and he remembered that. Listen, he was prepared back when he was a shepherd boy watching the sheep. God used that. Never underestimate when God is preparing someone, even when all they're doing is working in a field, watching over sheep. The threats hurled at him by Goliath only stirred him to trust God more and literally then run into the battle. He exudes confidence. There's no question about that. I pray that's been a blessing to you. A common story, one that we're all familiar with, but yet there are plenty of times where we need to read it again, go through it again, that we might be encouraged when we have to face our giants, when we have to face odds that seem like they're against us.